When homing pigeons were first released into the skies above London during World War I, they quickly made their way back to their coops. The birds had never flown over the city before, and yet they somehow knew their way home. Since then, we've been trying to figure out how pigeons navigate across cities, and it turns out there's a lot more to their navigation than we thought. Hi, and welcome to this channel. Some of the most compelling evidence that pigeons use landmarks to orient themselves comes from the work done by this guy, a pigeon researcher who started studying homing pigeons in the 1950s. He wanted to understand how pigeons could be so precise when they navigate. Like, these birds can travel up to 60 miles per hour, and they do want to get lost when they're recrossing towns or mountains. So Einset began training pigeons to fly between two lofts. One loft where he would feed them and one loft where he would keep them overnight. When the birds learned the route, he would release them at one loft and see if they'd make it to the other one. And in the beginning, they did just fine. But after a few weeks, something odd began to happen. The pigeons started to go off course, flying in wide loops around the city of Brussels. They didn't change the overall route that they took, but they weren't nearly as direct as they once were. Now, this was strange because the birds were only getting lost in Brussels. In every other city, they flew perfectly to their destination. So Einset decided to do some pigeon detective work to figure out what was going on. He started by having his pigeons fly between two lofts in the same building, a control experiment to make sure everything was okay, and the birds flew the route perfectly. Next, he moved the pigeons to separate lofts in different buildings, but still in the same neighborhood, and again, no problems. Then he moved the pigeons to lofts that were two neighborhoods apart, and they still flew the route correctly. But when he moved the pigeons to lofts that were 4 neighborhoods apart, that's when they started to get lost. So then Einset began to search for landmarks in those areas that might help the pigeons navigate, and he found some big ones, like the spire of a church and the tower of a grain silo. But those landmarks were in the pigeons' line of sight. If the birds were flying due north, they would pass right by the church and the silo. They wouldn't need any special skills to find those landmarks. And indeed, the pigeons didn't seem to use those landmarks when they were navigating in other parts of the city. But Einset noticed that the pigeons did have trouble finding their way when he moved the lofts to the other side of the city, even if they were only 2 neighborhoods apart. So then he began to look for landmarks that the birds could use to get their bearings, like large buildings, parks, and the city's main railway station. And he noticed that the birds always seemed to take a bearing from the station. They'd take off from their loft, fly in a straight line for a bit, then adjust their course and head in the right direction for the rest of the trip. It seems like the pigeons used the railway station as a compass. Once they had a line of sight to the station, they could fly anywhere in the city using that angle. Now, this is still a bit odd because angles are hard to calculate, especially for a bird with a brain the size of a walnut. But once Einset began to piece together all of the clues, it started to make sense. The pigeons were using a combination of visual landmarks and the sun's position to navigate. When they took off from their loft, they'd orient themselves using the sun, then use landmarks to correct their course and keep them on track. In other words, the pigeons were taking a kind of mental map with them wherever they went, which allowed them to navigate new routes and return home after traveling long distances. Now, this may not sound all that impressive until you realize that pigeons have been doing this for thousands of years. Humans didn't invent maps or compasses, but many cultures around the world have documented keeping pigeons for their navigational abilities. The ancient Greeks kept fancy breeds of pigeons and used them for hunting. Romans kept pigeons in their colosseums to entertain crowds. And people in China have kept and bred pigeons for at least 2,000 years. Some believe that Marco Polo brought the first domesticated pigeons from China to Europe in the 13th century. And ever since then, humans have been fascinated by these birds and their mysterious navigation skills.